Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are in the middle of Unit 6, discussing the judicial branch, and in a couple of our previous lessons we have discussed the federal court system and the state court system, as well as just a general introduction to the judicial branch overall. So to wrap up this half of our unit and our non-Supreme Court case section of the unit, we're going to round this out with the judicial process. So this is essentially, don't draw this, by the way, this is essentially the process of how we start with a crime being committed all the way to a case reaching the Supreme Court. And this is a good kind of segue, bouncing off point from going through the federal court system and the state court system into how a Supreme Court case actually goes to the Supreme Court from when it starts. So this is the process that all of our court cases will follow overall. Okay, there are two major types of cases that are heard in court, and there are multiple types of courts to answer different questions. So the two main types of cases, number one, is a criminal law. So there should be 3 bullet points or 3 boxes on your note sheets, okay? And this particular section corresponds to each box. Okay, so in the top one, someone has broken a law and a crime has been committed if someone were to end up in criminal court. Okay, so an example would be if someone stole all the good snacks from Sheetz and got caught, or if someone tried to be GTA 5 in real life and decided to steal a car and winds up getting charged with Grand Theft Auto. Another example could be felony assault, jaywalking, it could be a severe moving violation, so you could be going 15 miles an hour over the speed limit or faster, any type of thing like that. So just list a couple examples that you think will stick in your mind. Okay, the two sides to a criminal case are the prosecutor versus the defendant. So if you have ever watched an episode of Law and Order or Blue Bloods or Law and Order SVU, any show of any criminal type that has some type of case read out loud in it, you'll know it'll say like the people versus O.J. Simpson or the people versus Scott Peterson, whatever it might be. The people of North Carolina are represented by a prosecutor. So this person is the one who tries the case in front of a court, and the defendant is the person who is being accused of a crime. So in the People versus O.J. Simpson, the prosecutor would be the person who represented the people of the state of California versus O.J. Simpson. Okay, so the prosecutor is again who is trying the case. The defendant is the person who's trying to keep themselves out of prison. All right. Moving along to civil court. This is just a little bit different, and this is less popular because most of the time any crime that is being publicized or given a lot of media spotlight is one that is a criminal case that can draw interest and can draw people to the news station for views. All right, civil cases, not so much. There might have been a few here and there that you may have heard of, but they don't involve bodily harm, and the details are not quite as dramatic and don't draw quite as many people and don't draw a crowd. So in a civil case, a contract was broken, and a contract is just a simple agreement between 2 or more parties. All right, so an example would be if you've heard of the phrase like, oh, you can spill a cup of coffee at McDonald's and make $1 million. Not quite so much. A civil case would be like, your granny is in a nursing home and she falls and breaks her hip because nobody's watching her, and she lays on the floor for 2 hours because nobody knows that she's there and doesn't pay attention to her, and she winds up with a broken hip and an infection and all this kind of thing. If you and your family would like to sue the nursing home for damages because they neglected her, you can sue them in civil court. Literally any Judge Judy case, Judge Brown, Judge Mathis, whomever, all right, any of them technically are not judges, and we'll get into that in Unit 7. I know I just kind of blew your mind a little bit, but civil law is anything that is a contract being broken. So if someone doesn't pay their rent, the landlord can take them to court and get the rent back. If somebody said they were going to give someone some money and never did, they can sue them for that. Child support, to sue for child support, not because the person is behind in child support, but to sue for child support overall or divorce court, anything like that is a civil case. These two sides are just a little bit different. So on this side, nobody's trying to put someone in prison unless they're like a vengeful baby mama or something, but a plaintiff is one side and the defendant is the other. The defendant is the common theme between criminal and civil cases. So the plaintiff is the person who is actually complaining. So plaintiff complaining, right? And the defendant is again the person who is accused of not paying up, not doing what they're supposed to do, not upholding their end of the contract, that type of thing. If a professional athlete decides that they want to leave a particular team prior to their time agreement being up, let's say we're talking about like I don't know who just got signed. Mike Trout just signed a 12-year deal with the Los Angeles Angels for $430 million. It's a record-breaking contract, the most any professional athlete has ever been paid in a contract. If he decides tomorrow he's not playing baseball anymore and he just walks out of the stadium and he's not doing it, he won't do that. But in general, if he does, the Los Angeles Angels could sue him, and they would be the plaintiff in that case because they are complaining about Mike Trout walking out of the stadium, and the defendant would be Mike Trout, a Major League Baseball player who was accused of breaking the contract that he signed. All right, moving right along. If you hear like you just got served and somebody like puts a stack of papers in front of their hand, that's usually that someone who's been served with divorce papers or an order to come to court, something like that. All right, so what happens when a case goes to court? How do we get from that to the Supreme Court? Well, first and foremost, we know because we're smart that cases start at the federal district level or the state district level. Every state, all 50 of them in the United States, their state courts might look a little different from ours, but they all have a bottom district level. So if nothing else, whatever case you have, if it's civil or if it's criminal, they're going to start at the district level. And they have original jurisdiction. Okay, from there, the jury is going to rule guilty or not guilty. All right, if they rule guilty, they've convicted someone of a crime. If they rule not guilty, they have acquitted them of a crime. O.J. Simpson was acquitted of his crime. Okay, because he was found not guilty by the jury. Number 3, the judge then issues the sentencing if and only if the jury decides to convict the defendant on one or more counts, whichever is on their record. Okay, I'm going to skip over this one. That's basically a judge listing out all these convictions, and she says, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The defendant will serve blah, blah, blah years for this count. How do you find the defendant? Guilty. The defendant will serve, rinse and repeat. Okay. Number 4, your lawyers can appeal. Okay, so if we're talking about, let's say, for example, we're talking about Cardi B, okay, and she, let's say, in our hypothetical world, she has strangled Offset, okay, and she's been charged with felony assault, all right, and she winds up with a guilty verdict hanging over her head, and she's in jail in the Bronx. Sad time for Cardi B. However, she and her attorney can file an appeal. That means that you have moved up a level because we know, like Drake, you start from the bottom and you get to the top in the federal court system or the state court system. She can appeal that verdict, all right, and move on up into appellate jurisdiction. Then the appeals court, aka the 3-judge panel, has one of 3 choices, okay? In the question here that they're trying to answer, was the law applied fairly? If they say yes, they keep the guilty verdict, send her back to cell block D, and deny her appeal overall. They can say no, the law was not applied fairly to her. They can overturn her guilty verdict, and she goes back to the Bronx. All right, or they can remand her and be like, we're not really sure if the law was applied fairly to you or not. We're just going to send you back down and give you a new jury. Okay. All right, and moving on to number 6, the case could skip to Supreme Court or go there after appeals court, okay? So if the case is high profile and asks a constitutional question of some type, all right, the case could skip from district up to Supreme Court if and only if you have petitioned the Supreme Court to hear it, because they choose their own cases, and if you don't apply, they don't listen. Right, and then we hop up to the Supreme Court. Side note, how do they choose their cases? They have to be very selective because at any point in time they can receive anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 cases a year. That's 5,000 to 8,000 people who say, this is what happened to me, I think you need to take a look at this. They have to be very selective because there are only so many hours in a day that they can do things with their time, okay? So there are usually 2 factors that affect that. A, it affects a significant amount of the American public, or B, it answers a constitutional question. So they selected the case about gay marriage because it answers a constitutional question. Is gay marriage constitutional? They chose Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas because it affected a significant amount of the American public. It affected every single child that was school age, so 18 or younger, in all 50 states on as to whether or not schools should be integrated, okay? That type of case affects a significant amount of the American public, so they chose that case. So typically speaking, if they choose their case, one of these two or both of these factors are present. Okay, so once they decide to hear case number one, and you can pause at any time and write this down. All right, SCOTUS, which we know is not a disease, it's the Supreme Court of the United States, selects a case for what's called the docket and reviews the lawyer's summary of what's happening. So a docket is just their schedule for the day. So if you were to look up on my board at any point in time, there are a couple of bullet points up there beside the first, second, and third period boxes on the main board. All right, and that's our docket for the day, our schedule. Okay, so they have the same thing, a schedule of cases being heard, and their schedule is not just daily, it's throughout the entire year. Okay, number two, oral arguments take place. They fuss back and forth. Typically, the defendant and the prosecuting attorneys will get up and they will just state their case. They will present any pertinent evidence, and they will present any rulings that previous courts have laid down, and they will explain why that's either a good thing for their client or a bad thing for their client. Okay, and then the judges, at least 6 of the 9 of them have to be present for them to hear these arguments because they need a quorum. Okay, and after that, the justices will conference and vote, and the majority wins. So at least 5 out of the 9 have to agree. All right, and their decisions must be written down and released to the public. I'm going to tab over real fast to this. All right, so here is what a typical opinion would look like. This particular case was argued, if you look here, in October. This is Madison versus Alabama. Certiorari is the Latin term. Basically, this is the answer to the Circuit Court of Alabama in Mobile County. All right, so this was argued in October the 2nd of 2018 and not decided by them until February the 27th of this year. Okay, so Justice Elena Kagan, who is one of the 3 women on the Supreme Court, she writes out this decision. So Justice Kagan delivered the opinion of the court. So of the justices, at least 5 of them said, yes, we agree with Justice Kagan and what she says. And then she writes out her whole opinion, and it's like 5 pages long. Okay, so she writes out this whole thing, and that's their opinion. Okay, and their decisions could either be the majority, so the decision the most justices agree with, the dissenting, so they are against the majority unless judges agree, or concurring, so they agree with the majority but for a different reason. And we'll get into some examples of this later on today. All right, so how do they make decisions? They base it on the Constitution, not politics, not how the public feels, and they take into account precedent, okay? So the cases that revolve around the same thing, articles and amendments that are relevant, okay, and then stare decisis, or let the decision stand. So they'll also take into account what happened in lower courts before they issue their own opinions. All right, and that has been the judicial process.